We get ready for Memorial Day. I know growing up that meant staying home from school and probably having some family over and barbecuing and maybe watching a war movie at home. But never really was talked much about. And when I think about most of our holidays as Americans, that's usually what it amounts to. Specifically when it comes to our civil holidays, Memorial Day and 4th of July and those kinds of things, where it's usually focused on taking off of work and hanging around the house, maybe doing some yard work, maybe getting together with some people. But usually it's not really much more than that. And really a lot of our other holidays that we celebrate amounts to the same thing, of just sort of hanging out and being with family, and not really considering why it is that we're spending that time together. Now, I'm not trying to bust anybody's chops. Okay, it's not that there's anything wrong with doing those things. However, taking and considering what it is we're supposed to be memorializing. And as Christians, we have a memorial feast every Sunday that we keep in the forefront of our mind the sacrifice that Jesus made for all of our sins. And so as we look here in the book of Esther, there's a lot of directions that we could go with this book. A lot of times when we study this book, it's a study of God's providence. It's the one of only 2 books in the whole Bible that God's not even mentioned. His name is not mentioned at all in this book. It's also a book that many have put forward as a book, a character study of a woman that maybe Christian women should model themselves after. I don't know if that's the case. When we start considering some of the details of Esther's story and her life and where she was and the circumstances that she found herself in, I don't know that that's necessarily a good character study to model young women's life after. Okay, not saying that it's wrong, but there's a lot of ways we can study this. But I really enjoy this book for, don't get me wrong, it's certainly a book that we should study to be able to apply to our life, but it's entertaining. It's a good book. It's a book of intrigue and espionage. It's a book of political maneuvering. It's a book of extreme hate and extreme love. It's a book that finds a people in a tough situation that seems like a lose-lose, and it ends with a big fight and victory for the good guys. So there's it seems like it's covered all the bases there. You could take the wife or the girlfriend to the movie theater to see this one, and everybody would be happy, even the kids. But this morning I want us to focus on the idea here of why they celebrate at the end. They came up with this 2 days of celebration. The Jews, the Israelites had a lot of days that they feasted on, a lot of days that they took off for various reasons, given by law, by God. This was not one of them. This was one that Mordecai, one of the main characters in this book, Esther's father figure, cousin, but father figure, made up at the end of a 2-day celebration that we looked over just very briefly for the scripture reading, where we're going to take 2 days off and we're going to have a big party. And we're going to think about the things that happened, why we are celebrating. And we're going to send gifts to each other, and we're going to send gifts to the poor so everybody can appreciate and celebrate and remember this day of victory over our enemies. And it's fun, as I was reading through some of the commentaries, I kind of laughed out loud, and Aaron says, "What are you laughing about?" And I said, just what the Jews do when they celebrate this day, these 2 days they call Purim. Because it kind of extended out beyond just the 14th and 15th of that month, Vadar, which is March. They included the 13th too. And they would all go to the synagogue on the 13th, and they would read the story of Esther. And the kids would have these little rattle shakers. And anytime Haman, the bad guy in the story, is mentioned, they would say something along the lines of, may his name always be accursed, or may his name always be forgotten. And the kids would rattle their rattles every time the name would come up. You think about booing and hissing every time his name was mentioned. And then they'd all go home, and they'd come back the next day, and they would reread it. But this was more of a solemn reading of the passage here. And at the end, they would say a prayer. They would have a prayer service of thanks to God for delivering them. And then they also had the feasting and the celebrating. They would go home on the night of the 13th and the 14th and the 15th, and they would kind of, think about Thanksgiving and Christmas all rolled into one big celebration there. Sending presents to each other, a big feast like, you'd have the yams and all that kind of stuff, the cranberry sauce. That's what they did every year in celebration. And this was just one of them. They were commanded to keep celebration feasts, or memorial feasts rather, like the Passover feast. And we ate elements from the Passover feast this morning. It was from that Passover feast that the Jews would remember back every year. Back to Moses and the Israelites leaving Egypt in a hurry. That they had painted the doorposts with blood so that the God would pass over their firstborn and only kill the Egyptians' firstborn. But to set the scene here, we're going to go through and look at some highlights from this story. Like I said, I really like this story here. And so we're going to skip some of the stuff that we don't have time for this morning. But the opening scene, we see this king Ahasuerus, he's identified. And this guy is the image of pomp, of pride. He's this Persian king who comes from a line of very prestigious Persian kings. King Darius the first was his father, I believe, and anyway, two famous kings before him. I can't remember from my world history class, and I didn't write it down. He was the Persian Empire was primarily dominated by this religion called Zoroastrianism, and that's a big fancy name that, for the most part, that religion has completely died out. It's still present though, and this is sidebar. I won't take too much more time, I promise. But I like this little detail that I found. Okay? Because this religion was focused on a one supreme deity that was all good. And if you lived your life good and did good things and worshiped this deity and you made sacrifices to this deity, then you would go to paradise. Sound familiar? It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, organized world religions that we have. And now, if you were to go to almost every single college world history class in the country, they would say that Judaism and Christianity and Islam and many of the other religions in the world branched off from Zoroastrianism, but I think that you're looking at it from the wrong point of view. If you consider that Adam and Eve were the first humans, and they worship the one supreme deity that is all good and all powerful and all loving, then it makes sense that there's a lot of people that would worship something similar to that, if not in a perverted fashion. And so we see this king here getting rid of his wife, Queen Vashti, because she wouldn't come and dance at this drinking party they were having. And so he gets rid of her. And he has this big thing where he brings in all the beautiful women from his entire empire. And this was a vast empire that he had. In fact, before this, he had taken, and don't fact check me on this because I'm probably going to get these numbers wrong, but like 2 million strong army to invade Greece. He had conquered everything else. And he gets to Greece, and you know the story of the 300 Spartans at that pass there. I can't remember the name of the pass. That's this guy. Okay, that's Xerxes. That's King Ahasuerus. That's him. And he's defeated there, and then he's stopped from going into Macedonia, and he's sent back home with his tail between his legs, having lost almost all of his men. You don't recover from that kind of a thing, and he didn't reign very long as a result. In fact, we see some assassination attempts made on his life by a couple of doormen that didn't like him, and were mad enough to try to kill him off. And so Esther's brought in, whether by force or by volunteer, and I don't know, but she's brought in as one of these beautiful women to try to please the king. And it's almost this competition where they would go and there was a couple of requirements. They had to be beautiful and they had to be virgins. And so they spend a year being beautified. And we could look there, we're not going to go through it, but 6 months I think they spend dealing with oil on their skin, taking baths of oil and all this. And it all led up to this one point in time where they go and they can select some things that they could bring with them into the king's presence. And if the king liked them, he would call them back by name. Otherwise, they would go and live the rest of their life in this other house, never seeing the king again. And that was the case for most of them. But Esther, we see in chapter 2, verse 7, that she was beautiful. And I don't know, there's no real description of her. But can you imagine a woman that among all the most beautiful women in the whole empire, we're talking about spanning 2 continents, makes such an impression on the guy who's in charge of taking care of all of these beautiful women that he puts her before all the other ones and gives her special treatment, gives her extra stuff, gives her details and advice before she goes in to see the king. And what's more, it's not just that he was impressed by her, but then the king was impressed by her. Some kind of woman. And so she's called back and made queen. All the while, the guy that was in charge of taking care of these women, King Ahasuerus, and the bad guy that we haven't been introduced to yet, didn't even know that she was a Jew. They had kept that secret. Her and her cousin Mordecai had kept it secret. And so we see this young Jewish woman, now the queen of the most powerfulest empire in the known world at the time. And her cousin makes the second in command really upset. You see, Haman is the bad guy. And he's the classic villain. The kind of guy that is a bad guy just to be a bad guy. And when you stop and think, what is it that made him so angry that he was willing, as we see in chapter 3, I believe in verse 8 and following, the only thing that happened to upset him was that Mordecai, this Jew, refused to bow down and pay homage to him as he walked by. And so as a result, he convinces King Ahasuerus to make this decree to where all the Jews can be killed on this certain time of day. And Haman figured this out by rolling some dice, and whatever it landed on, that was going to be the month and the day that they were going to have this attack. Genocide of a people because one Jew refused to bow down. That's a big deal. What's more, though, he says there in verse 9 of chapter 3, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who would do the work to bring it to the king's treasury. 10,000 talents doesn't really mean a whole lot to us today, but the empire was divided up into 20 different satrap counties, if you will, countries. The entire budget for the one district or satrap that they lived in was 15,000 talents of silver. The annual budget. So Haman is angry enough not only to try to convince the king to allow complete genocide of the Jews for Mordecai, but he's willing to pay 2/3 of the annual budget into the treasury. It's a lot of money. It's an angry guy. And so we see this plot move forward. As Ahasuerus says, okay, keep your money, but really he's expecting him to insist that he give the money to the king. But Haman's figuring, hey, after we kill him, we can go and plunder, and I'll make all that money back plus some. And so the king puts the stamp on there. And once that stamp's on there, it's done. Can't be changed now. That's the law, and it is what it is. Well, Mordecai finds out about this, and he's upset. He's in sackcloth and ash, and Esther hears about this and says, well, I can't have you sitting here doing this. So she sends him some clothes. Hey, dress up. Act respectable. He says, do you know what happened? Going over to chapter 4, he sends this message of the written decree in verse 8 of the destruction that was supposed to happen. And that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead for his people, for her people. So this messenger returns back to Esther in verse 9 with the words of Mordecai. And then Esther spoke to him and said, gave him a command from Mordecai. All the king's servants, in verse 11, and all the people of the king's providence know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king, who has not been called, he has but one law. Put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king's these 30 days. And then verse 13 is an important passage. He says back to Esther, do you not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews? For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther's faced with a difficult choice. She's faced with the possibility of being executed for going into the king uninvited. And Mordecai says, well, you could die, yes. However, if you don't speak up, do you think you're going to be spared by this destruction? How do you know that you're not in this place at this time for this specific reason? Sometimes we find ourselves in difficult situations. Sometimes we find ourselves in a lose-lose, seemingly lose-lose situation. Caught between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't seem like I can win either way I go. If I do what's right, something bad's going to happen. If I don't do anything or I do what's wrong, something bad's going to happen. And Mordecai says, how do you know that you're not here at this time and place to do God's will? And what does Esther do? She goes in uninvited to the king. Can you imagine what that must have been like? I think it says there she takes, 3 days. Pray and fast for me. She takes some time. I can't see it real quick here, but I think it's 3 days. Pray and fast for me for 3 days, and then I'm going to go in. It's almost like a kid on the high dive for the first time. All right, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Wait, start over from 1. And I'll go on. When you say 1, 2, 3, jump, then I'll jump. It's almost like she's got to build up this courage because she goes into the king Ahasuerus and he doesn't extend that thing and she doesn't touch it, then she has forfeited her life. So as she walks down the halls of that palace in her rich garments and enters into that throne room, can you imagine what was going through her mind? And there, he's happy to see her. She had been blessed with beauty. Maybe that was why. Maybe she had a smart aleck attitude and he liked that. Or maybe she was meek and he liked that. Or whatever it was about her that struck Ahasuerus the first time he saw her, he was glad to see her when she came in. And so she invites him to this party. And she invites Haman, the bad guy. And Haman's all excited. Oh, right, yes. I'm going to a party with the king and the queen. And for whatever reason, maybe it was like I said, the 1, 2, 3 jump, and we got to do a start over. Hold on. She doesn't say what she wants to say at this first party. Well, I invited you to this party so you could come to another party tomorrow. And so they come back the next day. Haman in the meantime has constructed this gallows. I can't remember how high it is, but the 50 feet is coming to mind. I mean, this isn't just a normal gallows. This is an elaborate giant gallows for one man, Mordecai to hang on. Haman is filled with this rage, almost like a supervillain rage. I'm going to construct this giant, massive weapon to kill this one person that I want to kill. He's gotten this whole country in this uproar to kill the Jews because of one man's unwillingness to bow down and pay him homage when he walks by. He's willing to sacrifice a fortune to kill this one guy. And he's constructed this elaborate, almost comical gallows in order to do so. And a gallows, not thinking gallows that a hangman hangs on, but it's basically a big pole with a spike at the top of it to impale him on. This is an evil dude. And so we see this next party come in. And Haman is all feeling good about himself for a couple of reasons that we haven't really covered. And the king comes back for this party, happy to see his wife again. And Esther maybe has built up some courage that the king was pleased to see me when I came in unannounced. And the king came to my first party, and he's agreed to the second party. So maybe he will be sympathetic to my plight. All the while, none of them know she's a Jew. None of them know that she's got this secret about her. Not that the Jews were particularly hated, but that they were a foreign people that had been captured. And, maybe we could assume that they were wealthier than some of the other people, because Haman thought that once I murder them all, we can steal from them and be rich. And so we see them here in chapter 8. Excuse me, I jumped ahead too far here. Chapter 7. They're in there at this party. They're lounging. They're eating. In verse 3 in chapter 7, then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said in verse 6, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. We've considered what Esther's point of view might have been when she goes to the king. Can you imagine Haman walking in on cloud 9 as he's just been honored by the king, as he's been invited back to this party, and as she starts to tell what is on her mind for real? Almost like Haman's thinking, oh man, is she talking about the plot against the Jews? She can't be. She's not a Jew. Oh, she is talking about the Jews. She just said my name. Look at what the king does here. So Haman was terrified at the end of verse 6 before the king and queen. Then the king arose, and in his wrath from the banquet of wine, and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, he covered Haman's face. And there we've got 50 cubits. That's taller than 50 feet. I'm not going to do the math here, but it's a really big spike pole. But this eunuch says to the king, look, there's a gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him up. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Man, we could end it right there. The bad guy just lost big time. Impaled on his own spike in his own backyard. This guy says, hey, look, there's the gallows that he made for Mordecai, which Mordecai protected the king. And we would think that's the end of the story. Great story. They're saved. And yet that decree the king had made, that law that this evil Haman had tricked the king into making, couldn't be changed. And so the king makes this other decree. Hey, all the Jews, they can be armed and they can defend themselves. And they did. And they had a big victory. It was a split victory, however. That's why we've got this Purim, this 2-day celebration of Purim, where the Jews sort of in the countryside were able to defeat the enemy quicker than those in the city. And so they started celebrating on the 14th, and then the rest of them celebrated on the 15th. That's a good ending to a story. That's the ending of this epic tale of where the big battle ends and they're all happy and celebrating. And the Jews celebrate this even to today. We've got this story of this young woman who finds herself in a difficult situation. We can look at countless stories, as we looked at Audie Murphy last week, of people in tough situations and are faced with doing maybe what's easy, what they're allowed to do. Can any of us really blame Esther if she didn't want to go into the king? She could have rationalized. She could have said, you know what? Something else will happen. It wouldn't have been sinful for her. And yet she was bold and courageous to go in and speak on the behalf of her people. She took her life in her own hands, did what was right, and God saw her through it. We could look at other examples, though. As we read in Hebrews 11 last week, of these men and women of faith in the Bible. Some of them were victorious physically on earth because of their faith. Some of them were victorious because of their faith after Jesus comes back, though. They gave the ultimate, they gave the sacrifice of their life. Some were sawn in two. Some were fed to lions, impaled, burned alive, all these things because of their faith in God. We see this example of Esther, this great hero of faith, was successful because of her faith. When we remember our countries and those who sacrificed for our country, whether it was in their military service and they came home, or those who gave the ultimate and died on the field of battle, we do remember the one, Jesus Christ, every Sunday, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson. We can have these memorial days. We can have the 4th of July and Flag Day. We can have Veterans Day, VE Day, VJ Day. And yet the one memorial feast that has captured the world, the number one religion in the world. We talked about Zoroastrianism as one of the oldest, if not the oldest official, we'll say. Christianity, though, is still the largest religion in the world today, by about 1 billion. And there's more people that know the name of Jesus than know the name of Audie Murphy, George Washington, any of the other heroes from American history. But even those heroes of the Bible, Jesus' name is known above Esther's name. How about Stephen, who preached just the truth and was brought out and stoned to death? We are saved because of Jesus' sacrifice. And it's through the faith in Him that we will ultimately be victorious. Are you on the right team? Are you making the right choices? There's always the easy choice. And sometimes the easy choice is the right choice. But are you willing to make the right choice when it's the hard choice? Through faith in Jesus Christ, we can be victors. If you want to be on his team, you can wash your sins away in baptism, calling on the name of the Lord as we come and stand and sing.